Welcome, class, to our last lecture of the school year. That was so loud, and there's confetti everywhere. Today we're talking about the thrilling, uplifting topic of the Great Recession, the 2008 financial crisis, how the economy kind of crashed and then maybe it came back. Hopefully you've got your lecture notes out, you're ready to write. Let's get rolling. You're probably wondering at the beginning, what is a recession? And maybe you've heard of the Depression, right? Because there was the Great Depression, and now we're talking about the Great Recession. So a recession is like a mini depression. You see here in the bottom, a recession is a bad economy for like at least 6 months. A depression with a D, that's for multiple years. Just to get that out of the way. All right, let's get started. So our objective here is to be able to explain the 2008 financial crisis and its effects, right? How did it affect society? No event just happens on its own. There's always something else that comes with it. In order to explain this, we have to be able to explain what a mortgage is. Ooh, exciting, a mortgage. So, what's a mortgage? Great question. So, if you buy a house, right? This all starts with home buyers. If you buy a house, you gotta borrow money from the bank, right? A house is like what? $100,000, $200,000, $500,000. So you got to borrow that money from the bank. The bank is like, cool. So the bank gives you that money, and in return, you have to pay the bank back every month, plus a little bit of interest, right? You got to make it worth the bank's while. In return, the bank gets a piece of paper, and that paper is the mortgage, right? So that piece of paper says, whoever has this paper gets paid every month, right? Gets that payment. Now that paper, that mortgage, that can be sold to someone else, right? So that now the person who bought that house, they pay someone else, right? That paper can be bundled with a bunch of other papers, right? You can group that together so that like 100 different homeowners or like 1,000 different homeowners, they all now pay someone else, right? And of course, if you stop paying your mortgage, if you stop making regular payments, the person with that paper, whoever holds the mortgage, they get to take your house, right? They don't get their payments, they get to foreclose, they get to take that house, right? So we got that out of the way. We know what a mortgage is. Let's see why that matters. Why are we talking mortgages? Well, in the early 2000s, investors, right? The big bank investors, whatever, stock investors, they decide to start investing in mortgages. They decide to start investing in houses, right? People are making regular payments. Who's gonna not make their house payments, right? It's seen as a very solid investment to invest in mortgages. So banks start making money selling that paper, selling those mortgages, even little slices of that paper, right? Just like I just want a piece of those mortgage payments. Banks start selling that to big investors in big banks, right? So they start bundling together all those mortgages, all those homeowners, selling them off, right? People are like, I'm getting payments, right? And at the same time, we see the number of mortgages increasing, right? You think about Oprah saying, you get a house, you get a house, you get a house, right? Everyone's getting houses. Well, after a while, those mortgages start to run out, right? There's only so many people trying to get a house. So then banks start giving anyone a mortgage, right? Anyone who's looking to get a house, even if they don't have a job, even if they don't have the money to pay that back, they're like, doesn't matter. We're making a ton of money selling these mortgages, selling bundles of that paper, right? And so we start to see the advent, the creation of what's called a ninja loan, and not like karate ninjas, NINJA, no income, no job or assets, right? People with nothing were getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from banks in order to buy a house. Now, the thing with those loans, the thing with those mortgages is that they are what's called an adjustable rate mortgage, right? Sounds fancy. What is it? It means that for now, you're going to be able to make those payments, right? It seems reasonable now. But the key word here is adjustable. And that means that your monthly mortgage payment, how much money you pay to whoever holds that paper, that can go up anytime, any amount, right? So very quickly, it's possible that maybe you can't afford to make those mortgage payments every month, right? And that's quickly what started to happen with people who received those ninja loans, right? People who were getting loans that they probably should not have qualified to receive, but it didn't matter because let's look at the second bullet point here. Investors were buying up this paper, buying up the mortgages, and they were making money, right? Things were looking good. And by the way, you might also hear this talked about as the subprime mortgage crisis or the subprime financial crisis. Subprime means below prime, means less than good, means bad, right? And to give you an example, people are giving bad loans. Let's take John in this example here. John gets $150,000 from the bank to buy a house. The bank takes John's paper, bundles it with a bunch of other bad paper, subprime paper, pulls that together, and then other people are like, I want a slice of this right here. I want to invest in that because I know these people who doesn't pay their mortgage, right? Housing prices are continuing to go up, right? The thing is though, those housing prices, those were forming a bubble, right? Look right here, look at this graph before I even look at this text that's over there. Look at it. Housing prices are going up. It seems like housing is a solid investment, right? So more mortgages, that means more money to pay for houses. More money, we see rising home prices. People see rising prices and they're like, mortgages, that's a good investment. And you know what? Even if it isn't a good investment, doesn't matter. Even if they stop paying, doesn't matter. Because what happens if someone doesn't pay their mortgage? If they don't make those monthly payments? You get a house, right? And look, house prices are good. We can always sell the house, right? So this is seen as just like a solid investment. And then to make it seem even more safe, we have these agencies called credit rating agencies. And they basically look at investments and they tell people, like they put a grade on it. You know, maybe it's B or double B or double A or triple A. Triple A is the best. They were looking at these investments that were made up of people who had loans they couldn't afford, they couldn't pay back, but the credit agencies were saying they're a good investment. It's a triple A rating. They were not triple A, right? So eventually this has got to collapse, right? You see just like it's constantly going up for like no good reason. It's constantly going up. How does it collapse? So the House of Cards collapses right about January 2008. People suddenly realize that they can't make their mortgage payments. People start losing their houses, right? Hundreds of thousands of people losing their houses because, you know, they were given these kind of terrible loans, right? So that bottom rung, right? If we imagine the House of Cards as those investors, they immediately just kind of get knocked out. Meanwhile, those big investors were still making those investments. And then you had people, and I'm looking at these bullet points right here, you had people saying, hey, I see people making investments that are solid. Can I invest in that investment? Like, can I basically place a bet on that investment? And they were like, yeah, you can do that. And then you had another person, right? A third level here saying like, hey, that person's making a bet on that bet. Can I make a bet on that? Right? So you've got bets on bets on bets on bets, right? That's these upper parts of this House of Cards. Well, eventually, right, that bottom rung, it gets knocked out. People stop making their house payments because they can't afford to. By September 2008, the biggest investment banks quickly stopped receiving money, quickly stopped having people who could buy that paper, right? Basically, the money ran out. The housing ran out. And those investment banks that had placed all their bets on this, because it was seen as so profitable, the biggest investment banks were had either gone out of business, failed, were bought out by other banks. And so we saw banks here, like huge corporations, right? Like huge investment banks, Lehman Brothers. Maybe you've heard of Merrill Lynch or JP Morgan, Citigroup, Bear Stearns. Like these were huge organizations. September 2008, like people are seeing their retirement savings, like their investments. They're seeing those like basically getting wiped out, right? By this kind of irresponsible profit-seeking investing, right? And so immediately people start withdrawing their money. And just like we saw with the Great Depression, we saw banks and credit freezing up. The flow of money had basically stopped at this point, and the stock market and basically the health of the economy fell over 50% within a year, right? We're seeing a rapid collapse of the economy. But it's not the Great Depression, right? It's the recession with an R. So what kept it from going on for several years? What kept the economy from just completely collapsing? Well, there's what's referred to as the government bailout or the Troubled Assets Relief Program, right? So essentially, the government saw what was happening here, and the government recognized, especially like the Federal Reserve, right? The kind of the Bank of the United States. They saw what was happening, and they realized that if they did not bail out or help out these banks and give them some emergency loans, some emergency money to get by, that these were too big to fail, that too many people depended on these banking organizations, too many people depended on them, that if they failed, America was going to fail, right? So October 2008, right? Look how fast this is moving, by the way. I'm just going to go back a slide. January 2008, housing dies. September 2008, investment banks dying, right? October 2008, right? We've got the turnaround here. Congress says we will loan up to $700 billion to banks, to these big investors, to even auto companies that had also been investing in these mortgages, in those papers, to homeowners as well. Not as much as the big banks, right? Homeowners are important, but they were prioritizing these banks that everyone was depending on. So they loaned up to $700 billion to these organizations. And the goal here is to stabilize the economy, to prevent a collapse, to maintain confidence in the U.S., right? We want people to believe that you can still be successful, that you were not going to go through a Great Depression. So Congress passes this, and pretty immediately the public starts to look at this as a bad thing. We had 100 economists at this time write letters to Congress saying that this is unfair, right? That these investors should kind of suffer the consequences of their irresponsible investments. They said that the rules here were vague, that it seemed like the money that they were being given, that these investment banks were being given, that it seems like they could use them for anything. And also they were worried that it would have long-term effects, that this might change how banking, how investments and stocks and finance in general, that it might change how it was going to be done for the long term. Now, eventually, these funds, these loans, they were fully paid back by banks and auto companies, right? This wasn't just simply given away over time, especially as of now. All that money has been paid back, right? So we're all square, everyone's happy, right? Not so. What we see as a reaction to this, and specifically as a reaction to that money being given to corporations, is this thing called Occupy Wall Street. So by July 2009, right, so roughly a year later, 9 of those banks that got bailed out from the government, they gave over 5,000 of their top executives at least $1 million each in bonuses for how well they did during 2008, right? That sounds crazy, right? Like they basically like kind of helped out to tank the economy, and yet they're getting millions, sometimes billions of dollars in bonuses, right? Using sometimes up to half of that bailout money that the government gave them to give bonuses to executives. And right, and remember, right, there are hundreds of thousands of homeowners who suffered as a result, who got their homes foreclosed on, who end up on the streets, who end up, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, right? And so this draws attention to an issue of income inequality, right? This vast difference between, look at how these executives are being treated, look at how the government bailed them out, versus everyone else in society. And so an organization called Occupy Wall Street begins to protest this issue, camping out in Zuccotti Park in New York City, really in the heart of where all these kind of investment banks are, trying to draw attention to this issue of the top 1% of society, these richest people, seem to have a different set of rules than the rest of us, that we are the 99% who is suffering the results of this. And eventually they would be forced out of this park in New York City a couple months later. But that slogan, "We are the 99%," that continues to be one of the most enduring aspects of that movement, that there is a divide economically, financially, in society, right? And this is called maybe the most successful slogan since "Hell No, We Won't Go" back during the Vietnam War era, right? We are the 99%. It's very catchy, appeals to a lot of people. 99% of people, some would say. So where are we today? Well, in that whole crisis, in that whole thing, just one United States bank executive faced any criminal charges, right? It turns out that the rules were so lax that that kind of really risky, somewhat irresponsible behavior, that was perfectly fine, right? So only one person actually ended up going to jail for anything that happened there, right? And there's a lot of, it's hard to put the blame on any one person, right? Was it the homeowners for trying to get loans for a house? Was it the banks giving them loans? Was it the people investing in those banks? Was it the investors investing in investors, right? It's hard to say. But in 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act to try and counteract this, to try and set up some protections for consumers, to try and make all that kind of shady behavior that the banks were doing, to try and make that more transparent, and to prevent banks from secretly failing, to keep banks from suddenly like, oops, we're all out of money, right? To keep that from just happening in secret, to keep everything more transparent, and to protect consumers, especially when it comes to loans, right? They want consumers to know the terms of any kind of loan, of any kind of mortgage that's being given. Speaking of recession, we're currently in a recession, right? Depending on when you watch this video, maybe we won't be. But currently we are in kind of another downturn here, especially as a result of the current viral climate. You can see this here. We're in a downturn here. It's the worst one since the Great Depression. It was originally the 2008 recession was the worst one, and like 2020, we beat you 2008, right? So we're currently in a recession. We even see like big companies like JCPenney, J.Crew, Neiman Marcus, right? Big clothing companies going bankrupt. By the way, secret word here, it's going to be Marcus. Neiman Marcus, Marcus is the secret word. And so, where are we today? Well, the takeaway here, I think, is the quote from Mark Twain that history never repeats itself, but it rhymes, right? The negative aspects of history, the bad parts of history, they don't always happen exactly like we've seen before, but the good parts also happen to repeat. The good parts also happen to rhyme, if you will, right? So we had the Great Depression, we had the 2008 recession, we have a recession again, but we get lifted out, right? There's always hope around the bend. Those parts will rhyme as well. So keeping these lessons in mind, try to go forward, do good, make the good parts of history rhyme. Nice work. We're on to the next thing. I'll see you later. Hey, I have another popper. It's so loud.